Hello, I'm Stephen Matchett, and this is Expert Opinion, where we ask people who know what's going on in tertiary education. We ask them what's going on. Expert Opinion is produced by the new Future Campus site, and thanks to Amanda Johnson from Future Campus for making it happen. What's going on in tertiary education right now is the way higher ed and vet providers are working out their responses to the big ideas in last week's Universities Accord interim report. And perhaps the biggest idea of them all are the proposals for a learning entitlement for all Australians to use across a unified national system. The Accord sets out a national objective for 2035, and I quote, "While higher education and vet institutions continue to be identified by their highly distinct missions and characteristics, the tertiary education sector works effectively as a whole system to meet the education, skills and research needs of the nation." So how would it work? I'm joined by two policy experts who have ideas on that and the Accord overall. Hilary Winchester knows a bunch about the intersection of higher education and vet. She's now VP Governance at Charles Darwin U, a dual sector institution, and she is a previous provost of CQU, which also has higher ed and vet operations. Hello, Professor Winchester. Thank you for sparing the time.
Hello, nice to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
And Craig Fowler is with us. Dr. Fowler is a former managing director of the Estimal National Centre for Vocational Education Research, and he's worked across higher education and vet. He's now an advisor to the new Jobs and Skills Council, known as the Future Skills Organisation. Prior to the interim report of the OCAIM team, he put the challenge for Australian tertiary education in terms broader than the Accord. In a piece for Future Campus, he wrote, and I quote him, "Both higher ed and vet sectors are being overrun by non-accredited education and training, both good and bad quality, accessed globally, mostly online by individuals and corporates. Disruption has bolted, and any fixation on formal education sectors being sufficient to fix national skills is wrong." Let me ask you both, on the basis of that, does the Accord capture the broad issues that the system now faces?
Perhaps I should answer that first because you quoted me, and thank you for the invitation, Stephen. My answer in the broad would be I don't think the interim report as such has captured much of that thinking at all. It is still a rather conventional view as to the higher education sector connected to the vet sector, but it does not extend its thinking as yet into the space you've just described, and that is the non-accredited skilling system that exists in employers and in industry, and that students are increasingly accessing.
Sorry, Hilary.
I think I would agree with that. And it also talks in relatively conventional terms about vets to higher education pathways. Yet my experience of vocational students is that most of them are not looking for a pathway. Some are, and they can get a cheaper first year if they do a diploma of business, for example, and then carry on into a degree. But most of them, especially in the regions, are looking to get qualifications for, to deal with air conditioning or plumbing or commercial cookery. They're not looking for a pathway into a degree. And I think what would be more useful from an educational point of view is if we had degrees where people are coming out, say, as an environmental scientist, where they could actually do things, where they knew how to drive a Land Rover and wield a chainsaw. And that's where you find that the qualifications in vocational education are full of graduates. So there are those two ways, but I think there are more exciting ways, perhaps, to think about a unified higher education system.
It's interesting, Hilary should say that, because I looked at the numbers, and when you look at the question of what's the qualification, the highest qualification obtained by an individual starting a vocational educational course, and about 20% of the entrants actually have a bachelor's degree. Now, it doesn't say it was last year or when it was, but that's their level of qualification. And it's around 18% as I recall the numbers.
Is it going to revert? I mean, is the pathway going to go the other way, increasingly?
The pathways have been going that way for a long time. I remember Barry Golding writing about this 20 years ago, and there were actually more people treading the path from higher ed to vet than the other way around in his work.
The numbers I looked at is that they're actually about the same, but I think it's harder to get out of the university entrance bodies who are taking the new applicants in to get the right sort of numbers to see what is past educational attainment of each application. So we don't measure this very well. And it's vested in some excellence in interinstitutional agreements between some institutions in part of the country and lesser practice elsewhere.
Looking at Charles Darwin, I mean, are you sort of pioneered teaching people to fly drones or pilot drones?
Absolutely.
And it just seems it's an interesting example. You can have a whole bunch of degrees, but you actually need those mapping skills.
Well, you do. Drones are incredibly important up here because we've got this vast terrain and very few people, and the drones can do all sorts of things in the agricultural sector and the security sector. In fact, Fiona Nash was up here sort of playing with drones just a few days ago.
That's the regional education commissioner, Fiona Nash.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
What about where do micro credentials fit into all this then? It seemed that VET is in a better position to adjust relatively quickly to them.
Yes, and the evidence of micro credentials in VET is that for the most part, they are subjects or small groups of subjects associated with existing training qualifications, which are overwhelmingly paid for on a fee-for-service basis. So people are just picking as they wish. And New South Wales government is probably at the forefront of allowing some level of publicly funded subsidy on those activities. It's a use of the existing credited system. Where things are changing is because VET hasn't produced fast update of its qualifications. It's now a case of both the universities and their micro-credentials, who have typically a faster way of getting academic accreditation on that, and or the private sector simply offering short courses, call them what you like, and they are emerging as things that students want to pick. So drones is a good example. You'll find a number of institutions offering short courses around the use of drones in different environments. And I think that this will just continue, which is why I have in the past been a little puzzled why governments might fund platforms for micro-credentials, because that's the comment I made. I think things are bolted and there's both good and poorer quality out there, and people access it online.
But people do want skill sets, is often what we turn up here. You know, they often don't want a whole qualification. They want the skill sets that is going to get them that next job or that next promotion. I was talking to someone at random who wanted a limited skill set because she wanted to do 3D printing. She didn't want a whole qualification. She wanted to do 3D printing. And it seemed an eminently sensible thing to want.
And employers are more likely to provide some financial assistance around something that is connected to the workplace that the employee wants, and that it doesn't take a lot of time nor cost to get the work skill that both need and seek. So that mechanism will run. What's become a little confusing is great for the individual, but then all this bit about stackability and recognition and et cetera, becomes really rather confused. And I don't think, despite that, I think Beverly Oliver and her group with the micro-credentials framework did a fabulous job. I don't think we've actually got to the point of all this talk about digital badging and stacking. I think it's just, at the moment, somewhat unstructured, it seems, and it's running away.
I would say that the undergraduate certificates have been quite a success. And you're just packaging up, again, a small portion of something which gives people enough to get into the workforce. And we found those to be really quite successful and welcomed in the marketplace.
Yes.
Welcome because of the skill they actually teach, rather than the badge. Yes? No?
No, I didn't care about the badge. If you're talking about Indigenous teachers on community, to give them 6 months of teaching theory and practice so that they've got something, they don't care about the badge.
But yet this is something that needs to get tackled. Or maybe it doesn't, but the risk is qualification-wise, it just becomes a Wild West.
Yes.
And the reality is, you can have whatever you've got on paper. The question is, can you actually do the job? It's going to be the test that matters.
Well, yeah, I think so. And that takes us to the role of the AQF.
Yes, please.
Well, I don't know that I can say anything terrifically constructive about the way forward, but I would like to see the capacity in a higher education degree to build in some of those practical skills that mean people can do the job. And I gave the example of the environmental scientists, but there are lots of others. And if you think about creative arts, right, creative arts doesn't have great employment outcomes. So if you can put in there how to use the sound equipment, how to use the light equipment, how to create the sets, how to do stage makeup. But the trouble is the AQF says these are way, way down, they're not AQF 2 or something. And then you have to pretend to wrap a whole lot of theory around them if you're going to put them into a degree. So we need to do something cleverer with the AQF, and I think that the Accord is saying that. But whether it's the implementation of the Noonan Review, which I found incredibly complicated, I don't know.
Craig, do you have any sense of what's happening with the AQF? Minister O'Connor has announced, I think, there's a qualifications working group to report by the end of the year, but I don't know whether they're going to tackle the AQF.
No, and look, I'm not aware of any further public information that I once shared with you about that intent. So it's not clear to me. There may be some technical internal to government working groups on it, but I'm not aware of anything specifically publicly about it, other than that it is raised in the Accord. And whilst I agree with Hilary, it's complicated, it seems to me that we need to start at a particular point. And if you crudely, and it is crudely, lay the current AQF against what Peter Noonan and others proposed, most of the awkwardness sits at around the AQF 5 and 6 space. Maybe I'm a bit jaundiced about that, but that's where most of the awkwardness does seem to fit. The traditions of that overlap in the AQF. And it goes to the substance of Hilary's drone people or environmental scientists who want to drive a forklift. I think an intense effort focused on that gap area, well, it's not a gap area, focused on that specific area would be pragmatically the best way to get into it, rather than try to bite it all off at once. It's better to leave Cert 1s and 3s and their potential industrial issues and the apprentices and all of those things intact. And it's perhaps best to leave, for now, the AQF 7s and the bachelors and the other stuff intact. Whilst clearly a bachelor's degree could incorporate other material, I think we ought to focus in on a place where most commentators are saying is the most confused at present time, and where the blendedness and the best of the blendedness of both sectors could be dealt with. So I would call for bring back the band, Beverly Oliver and her band of about, there must have been about 20 good citizens in that group. I think that band had a very excellent cross-sectional view of both industry and academe and education and vocation. And I think they could sit and quietly nut through some of this, focus specifically on the AQF in this space and building on their micro-credentials view of the world and how we actually stack it and how we actually recognise it. I think that would be practically, and I've called on the citizens to come forward again, but I think practically that's where we ought to start at least.
Politically, is it saleable, given the importance of VET to state premiers?
I think it is, because about, and the numbers may be not entirely right, but I think diplomas and above in VET constituted less than 10% of the total body of students. If you include Cert 4s and diplomas and above, you're talking about, again, it's my memory here, you're talking about 65 to 70% are still in the Cert 3s and below.
Right.
That's where the majority of effort and interest and constitutional right for ministers to actually have control of. And bear in mind, although state ministers have real interest in retaining their business around VET, they have allowed the Commonwealth, ever since the disasters of VET fee help and now VET student loans, they have penetrated into diplomas. So de facto, parts of VET are being funded by the Commonwealth. So this space from diploma in the AQF 5-6 is already probably quite well infiltrated by funding from both sides, and is also not the main core of VET that ministers are mostly concerned about.
So Craig, why would they choose to, if they're eating the elephant one piece at a time, why would they start with that piece? If it's not what, yes, I can see it's a contested space and there's a multiplicity of providers and funding and different ways. But the main interest is not there, I don't think. It's messy.
VET ministers, and I'm only judging what they might do, but ministers would most be interested in that 80% block, which is Cert 3 and below. But I think they would be persuaded that the payback for their individual economies, their local economies, once students have attained a Certificate 3, is so much more if we can get this gap area, the AQF 5-6 space, a better integrated tertiary system into place for the very reasons that you started with, Hilary, and that is your mythical environmental scientist driving a forklift.
A four-wheel drive, I think. Did I say a four-wheel drive?
And I think there is big economic payback in that. And to the extent that the Accord interim report does venture some areas into institutional reform to actually achieve some of this. And I think that's relatively interesting to think about that, because and the minister for skills, the National Minister is talking about now centres of excellence. Now, they seem to me a bit like cooperative research centres, but
Yeah,
not
they
that,
say that.
not
Yeah.
for research, but maybe built along the same sort of entity and model and in collaboration, which goes specifically to how do you mix vet and higher ed activities, qualifications into one space for a defined industry purpose. So that might be one way into all of this.
So
Yeah,
is
there's
that,
been discussions. Sorry, go Steve.
is that the Trojan horse, the Trojan horse for a Commonwealth Tertiary Education Commission? Is that a role for it to try and pull all this together?
Well, perhaps Hilary can answer.
I don't know, but it could be. And I think with a lot of what's written in the interim report, you know, I can see benefits and I can see potential problems. It all depends on how these things are actually implemented, doesn't it? It's not the outcome is not determined, and especially if it's going to be by 2035. That's a long time, and it's a long time in political terms as well.
Well, and the history of federalism dictates there is always going to be a premier who for whatever reasons wants to play a states' rights card.
Yes, there will.
I think so, but there's probably more goodwill given the nature of the current incumbents in government to actually have a good crack at this. My sense is that there is a real opportunity to.
I think it would be worth, Craig, you and I, we could do a little workforce. We could get a little working group, because I'm at a tertiary institution, predominantly higher ed, with about 1/5 vocational. You, I think, still are associated with TAFE SA, predominantly vocational, and a smidgen of higher education.
That's about right.
So, you know, there's a lot of dual sector expertise about how you might bring these two really differentiated parts together, because they are different in not just funding and regulator, but enterprise agreements and awards, pay scales, but the whole works. There is
Absolutely.
a deal of work to be done.
Absolutely. And look, some institutions have worked diligently with all of the complexities of the current times and have built pathways for students that work quite well in some example areas. And there is some learning amongst all of that as well.
Indeed.
And I think that if that's an invitation, sure, we could do that. I was just impressed, and as I've raised with you before, I think Professor Oliver and that group of people could provide early advice about that. And if we are to have a tertiary commission, well, that's one of the things you'd like to see as a project to get on with. And we could go ahead and see the benefits of that.
Do you need to talk to the Amazons and the Ciscos and the Apples and the Googles?
I think
probably.
that is absolutely required. And to the extent that the Accord interim report, I think, fails to recognise the extent and breadth of the current penetration of industry by the universities. I think it's not merely the accreditation of accountants or dentists. I think that when you look at the individual examples across universities, there are some really good penetrations of major multinational and agreements. But I think that could be improved on, significantly, partly because, and I've been tossing around in my head, is a decline in graduates since 2014 a function of various things like COVID or other things? Or have young people said, no, to hell with this, I'm actually going to go get a job and rely upon my Google cadetship, and I'm just going to sail along and not bother with any formal stuff because it gives me a debt, and I can't be hassled with that, and I can make a career out of something which is outside of the conventional ways of doing things. I have a real suspicion that will grow.
I do think the vet and the funding issue and the debt is putting off some students, especially with the indexation of the debt, which probably isn't matching the indexation of their salaries.
I would thought that business, the industry connection model works better for vet than it would for higher ed.
Now, I think that's a fallacy we've got to challenge, Stephen. I'm not disagreeing with you, but I think that's an ancient presumption about where the systems are at the moment. I don't think we've got a decently revealed truth of current day about those arrangements.
Yeah,
Right.
so
I was thinking in terms of sorry, Hilary.
I
I was thinking more in terms of just flexibility and the ability of the two of a Google and a vet system to talk to each other rather than Google wanting to talk to a university system.
Yeah, the problem about vet is we have had training packages that have certain requirements and all of these competencies, et cetera,
Yeah.
and those are all nationally transportable, et cetera, and industry has likely got impatient with all of that stuff. It's probably easier to have a conversation with an academic senate at an individual higher education institution and convince them that this industry partnership and the academic excellence of what they're putting together is all doable because they have self-regulation. So I think that flows a little bit better in the higher ed space compared with what I see in vet.
Yeah, and there's actually some really good examples of that. You know, Federation universities had this sort of IT connection with major firms for more than 20 years. They're on their campus, they're introducing their credentials within the degree space, which I think is really beneficial in terms of employment. And I agree with you that health education, think of all the health degrees, the growth in the health workforce, and that is very embedded with the industry, with the hospitals, with the physiotherapy, whatever it happens to be.
Is there room to move where a group of universities, what I call the full service six, the dual sector ones, or the ATN, is the potential for groups across the country to start looking and basically to become more entrepreneurial and market and create their own links?
Indeed, because the dual sector group actually put a submission into the Accord.
I read it.
I think there's a lot of strength in that, and you know, some of the universities use each other for cross-validation, calibration, or you know, some of that quality assurance work, and there's a lot of good thinking in that group. But all that's not to say there isn't in the TAFEs that do higher ed, or even some of the little higher education providers that span both sectors.
There was a historic report, I think, by Phillips KPA, probably a decade old now, which looked at systematically the accreditation, industry university linkages, and the quality and the need for that accreditation. And just on thinking about what we've seen in the Accord, it's almost like we need to do that again, but in an expanded way.
There is I have a sense that the whole post-secondary system, a new combined post-secondary system, can just sink into a swamp of endless dispute and debate over qualification, which often comes down to power struggles between the various players. Is there any room for optimism? Am I being too pessimistic?
There's always room for optimism. I mean, I think, I was listening to the HeadX podcast, and people are excited. They do see that there is an opportunity. There's benchmarking that can be done. There are exciting times ahead, but probably what I didn't see in many of the parts of this interim report is the how-to. And I suppose I'm a bit of a pragmatist. I go, well, how is this going to work? And whether it's the commission, or whether it's the unified tertiary education system, or whether it's a national regional university. And you think, I can see many potholes in the road. And I'm not quite sure how you're going to get over those.
Craig?
For me, I think we tend to forget that there is much more right with the national post-schooling tertiary education system than there is wrong. There is a great deal of quality in both sectors and in work with industry, both in research and in transference of skills. So whilst we have this navel gazing, we do tend to forget that the system of itself is still, I think, world class. What has frustrated me a little bit is, I think, if you invoke the idea of the bicycle race, I think Australia has been sliding backwards in the peloton for some years now, for the reasons we've discussed, and which is why I'm enthusiastic to have things looked at in the way that the Accord is doing. There is one other aspect which interests me about the central thrust of the Accord, particularly around, or at least the interim report, and that is the absolutely excellent view that everyone should get every opportunity to lift their level of education. That's unarguable. Where I'm struggling to see is how that's going to be achievable in the numbers that are being presented, particularly from regional communities, from First Nation communities, etc. Because VET has been working for decades trying to engage with those organisations, with those regions and those people. And when you look at the number of people who are in the workplace who have no more than in the workforce with no more than schooling qualifications, there is a lot of work to be done. But I'd hate to see the situation where universities admit these students under pressure and then get beaten up because their ATARs are not good enough, or their outcomes are not as good as people want. The reality is we need to do an awful lot of in the schooling sector to actually prepare these people appropriately and sufficiently well so that they have the confidence in order to deal with this. And when I start seeing wraparound service assistance, which is meaningful and helpful, but expensive and time consuming if you're to customize it to individual students. Once you start talking about that into the higher education sector, which is what the verbiage we've been using for a long time in the vet sector, I'm beginning to have some concern about, yes, the aspiration is absolutely good, but can this actually be done within the fiscal envelopes we're going to have to support people in the way that they aspire to? And I think a lot of the solutions go back to it's the schooling and vet before you worry about higher ed. But that's my pessimism on an optimistic mode.
I do tend to agree that you can't expect the vocational or the tertiary system to compensate for the difficulties of the schooling system. And so many, so let's take the Northern Territory, in the remote areas, you get very, very few students who have access to a secondary education which gives them a university pathway. You don't have the students who are getting an ATAR, and if you take them on other mechanisms, principals recommendation or something similar, are you setting them up for failure? And that's a real problem.
I wonder if it will turn out to be a generational thing. I'm old enough to remember when governments had an objective of getting 70% 78% of school people through to year 12. And I suspect it had less to do with government and more to do with communities just getting into their head that year 12 was a goal. And whether, as people begin to realise that we live in a globalised, very technologically driven world, that they're just going to grasp that their kids are going to need to do something.
I agree that the change will be, there's been an enormous change in the last 30 years, 20 years, but there is a lot more to go.
Is that more a job for training than for higher ed, Craig?
Yeah, I mean, if you go back to the Gillard-Rudd days, they expressed, that government at that time expressed a learning entitlement that everybody would reach a Certificate 3 level. That was the sort of the aim of the world. Now, in some states that ran out of puff for reasons of budgetary constraints, and an entitlement of that kind, I think in principle is still the correct thing to do, because the trajectory of anyone wanting to get further qualifications or better themselves in the workforce, you really have to have the necessary language literacy and these days digital fluency in order to cope with what you're going to encounter. I mean, we cannot afford to let quality slide away at the expense of trying to put numbers through. And the foundations need to be fully in place at schools and in vet in order to get the sorts of numbers that this particular interim report is talking about, in my view.
Which will be very expensive.
Yes.
Very expensive. Yes, yes, and highly connecting, because when you say wraparound services, you don't mean, or you shouldn't mean, more public money just wrapped around the educational matter. It's actually connecting people to social welfare, to housing, to mental health. There's public money spent in those areas already. So the student treated as an individual in this way, their success is dependent upon many things and not just more money. It's more, more connected services that a lot of people are trying to present to these individuals in the first place.
God. That's very... Right. Well, I'm glad it's not me having to do it. Look, on that qualified optimistic note, Hilary Winchester and Craig Fowler, thank you so much. You've got lots to do, both of you, and it's been very kind of you. Thank you again. I'm Stephen Matchett. This is Expert Opinion, and we're out.